This happened last summer and started pretty much a year ago. I am a guy who spends quite a lot of time in front of my computer, and my room back at my parents' place has a window facing the road in front of the house. My computer is located next to the window, and when I'm sitting by it, I have that window to my right side. This means that if someone walks past the house, they can see me by the computer, and I often tend to look out the window whenever I see someone walking past in the corner of my eye. No big deal. So this all started when I noticed this woman, somewhere in her 20s, maybe early 30s, walking by quite often, as in 5 or 10 times every day. No big deal, of course. She probably just lives nearby, I thought, which I later found she did. This woman had a very uncomfortable look to her. It didn't look like she had showered in a while, and she had this extreme smile on her face, constantly, as if someone had stapled her face into that expression. I didn't think much about it until I noticed that she started trying to make eye contact with me. Since she walked by my window so often, I often caught her in the corner of my eye and unintentionally looked at her. Every time she got eye contact, she would start giggling/laughing uncontrollably. This went on for a week or two. I just thought she was mentally ill or something and didn't think much about it. Then one day, she walked past an insane amount of times, as in 15 to 20 times in a couple of hours, and each time she was constantly looking into my window when walking by. This is when I started getting uncomfortable. After unintentionally getting eye contact again, I quickly turned my eyes to the computer again, only to see in the corner of my eye that she had stopped, standing outside my window and looking right at me, laughing uncontrollably with her creepy smile on her face. I quickly pulled the curtains and tried to ignore it when I heard the doorbell. I opened the door, and there she was. I was home alone and starting to get some serious creeps. I was at the time babysitting my friend's poodle and picked it up to use it as some kind of protection. I said, "Hi," and she responded with a very, very happy, "Hello." She then said, "Now it's your turn." I had no idea what she wanted and only responded with, "Okay." She then started laughing a lot, as if she had just heard the best joke of her entire life. I started panicking and shut the door after quickly telling her to leave. I told my parents when they came home, and it turned out that this woman was an old student of my mother's. She said that she was mentally ill and that I shouldn't worry. Her visits outside my window continued every day, and I told my parents again that I felt uncomfortable. They then tried to talk to her to see what was up. My mom asked her why she did it, and she told her that she and I have some kind of supernatural connection in our heads, and that she and I have conversations with each other through some kind of telepathic way. We are made for each other and madly in love. That's when my parents started getting concerned. Her visits continued on a daily basis, and we visited the police to see what could be done. Their answer was that we couldn't do anything because of stupid laws in my country. She often rang my doorbell, but I had the sense not to answer. I noticed that as time went on, she got worse and worse mentally. She started to show aggressive behavior toward my parents when they asked her to leave. I have actually never seen my dad so uncomfortable and overprotective as he was at this time. He was worried as well. One day, something happened that was enough for me. It was Friday night, and I was home alone. I was watching TV and heard strange noises from the street. I peeked out the window, and there she was, outside my window, dancing, screaming, singing, and doing all kinds of strange things. I turned off all the lights in my house and pretended not to be home, but I could still hear her. She was still outside. My neighbors ended up calling me several times, asking if I was okay, and I said I was, but I wasn't. I was scared. My parents were hours from coming home, and all I did was watch TV, pretending not to be home. She stayed for an hour or two before leaving, and the week after, my parents and I decided to take action. We visited different mental hospitals in my county and tried to tell them what happened. But there was one problem. They didn't have her as a patient and couldn't help us. Neither could the police. To make the rest of the story short, this continued for the entire summer, and towards the end, she would often spy on our house, playing some sick game with a child she had started hanging out with. At this point, she was scared of us because she knew we had contacted the police and different doctors, and they were shouting things such as, "You see that house? Watch out for them, or they will call the police." She and the child would run and come back minutes later, repeating the same thing. The police visited our block several times, hunting her when she was clearly out of control. There are so many incidents I can tell you about this story, but it would take way too long to tell everything. I don't live at home anymore, and I haven't been bothered by her since, except for the time she tried to contact me on Facebook, but I instantly blocked her. I'm a 22-year-old college senior about to graduate and start medical school in the fall. This happened when I was in elementary school, so over a decade ago. Over the summer way back then, my mom sent me to YMCA summer camp. I enjoyed going in every day and hanging out with all my friends from school who also went to the camp, but I especially loved one of the counselors, Mike. Mike was always sitting in the same spot when I got dropped off in the morning, and he would see me walk in and put a huge smile on his face. We would always sit there and play cards or some other board game in the morning while all the kids were arriving. Once the day's scheduled activities started, Mike would always be the counselor in charge of my group. He would always be just close to me. As a kid, I didn't know that was weird. I really liked him, as I said, as I thought he was a really cool guy as an 8-year-old. Fast forward a couple years. My mom, my younger sister, and I were out at a state park in the area, about half an hour from where we lived. We had just gone down there to hang out for the day. We have a great time on the playground, walking around the trails, etc., and then we head back to the car. When we arrive back at the car, my mom was getting my sister all strapped in and ready for the ride home, and I was getting situated in the back seat as well. Now our car was in the parking lot, obviously, and there really weren't tons of people at the park that day. The lot was pretty much empty. So when I noticed that there was a car parked right next to our car, I was like, that's weird. But again, I was a kid and didn't really think anything of it. Why would this car park literally right next to us when I can see 50 empty spots from right here? Anyways, my mom is getting my sister and I all ready for the trip back home, as I said. Suddenly, the driver door of the other car opens, and out pops Mike. My mom recognized him, so she just said hi, and continued back to what she was doing. Mike says, "Do you mind if I take a couple pictures of I am a grocery bag? He's gotten so grown, and I want to remember this." My mom obviously goes, "No, you're not going to do that," and shuts the driver's door and locks the car, and we leave. As we're leaving, I can see Mike trying to take a photo through the windows of the car. A couple years later, when I was a bit older, my mom told me more details about Mike. My mom at the time was pretty high up in a company that pairs kids with adult mentors. Adults would apply to be paired with a kid. So my mom starts telling me about how one day they were going through the applications to be a mentor, and Mike's name popped up. Apparently someone else had interviewed Mike and recommended him for approval into the system. My mom, on the other hand, essentially vetoed it because she obviously had known Mike from these other experiences, and she got a weird vibe from him that something was off with him. So finally, we're watching the news at dinner one day a bit later. They start sharing a story about a man who was arrested, and they show the mugshot of the man, Mike. The charge? Thousands of images and videos of child porn that he both had made and was just in possession of. He actually was caught by Border Patrol, as he was acting weird when he was trying to cross into Canada, and they decided to search his car, and they found a bunch of it on his computer. They alerted US authorities, who then searched his house, and they found a ton more of it. I'm 100% confident that he wanted to add me to the collection. If not for my mom having a great mother's instinct and the border, it might have happened. This experience happened to me when I was 14 years old. I haven't spoken to anyone about the event since it happened, not even my significant other. I'm 20 years old now, about to double major with my first 2 degrees in psychology and anthropology. Recently, for reasons unknown to me, the memories of this strange happening have resurfaced and continue to plague my waking thoughts, as well as my unconscious and subconscious. As we are taught in psychology, talking about the situation could help with repressed trauma. So here it goes. I live in the high desert mountains of Southern California, situated just below the Sierra Nevada, about 30 minutes west of Mojave. My town is no booming metropolis. At the time, our largest market was a Kmart, one of the last still in business, I might add, and we only had 4 stoplights in town. This takes place in a subsection of the town about 13 miles from the shops, banks, and restaurants, in a small community largely inhabited by retirees. It was smack dab in the middle of summer, and the temperatures were well in the high 90s. My nightly routine consisted of walking my Australian Shepherd. However, I would wait until it was almost dark to avoid the heat. I grabbed my phone, a small pocket knife, some headphones, my pup, and set out for my nightly walk. My community is also home to a significant number of equestrian riders as well as cattle ranchers. The trails I walked were designated horse riding trails set between pastures. That night, I decided to take the horse trail that stretches for approximately 2 miles between back-to-back paddocks. It's basically a long, narrow trail between very large backyards. My ending destination was the Equestrian Center, a communal equestrian park where all types of horse riders could enjoy various activities on their horses. Making my way through the sandy terrain of the trail, it was nearly dark now. The sky was becoming a deeper shade of blue every time I looked up, and my dog was becoming harder to see. I estimated my arrival at the Equestrian Center to be around 15 minutes from my current position, so I sent a text to my mother. "I'll be at the Equestrian Center in about 15 minutes. Could you meet me there? I'm too tired to walk back." My mother replied, "Sure, I'll leave in 10 minutes. At this point, I was just outside the east entrance of the Equestrian Center, where the Enchanted Forest Trail connects to the straight trail I was on, sort of like a 3-way intersection. You can either go left into the Enchanted Forest Trail or go straight into the Equestrian Center. Before I reached the intersection of the trails, I noticed a shift in my dog's behavior as she became anxious and seemingly worried. She had her eyes fixated on the forest and stopped dead in her tracks. I played it off as another animal within the forest, like a bobcat or boar, as they weren't uncommon in my area. I gave her a slight tug on her collar, although she was still incessantly focused on the forest. With a little more convincing, I was able to get her moving forward, pushing on towards the Equestrian Center, where my mother would be waiting for our arrival. It was nearly pitch black now, with only the moon guiding me with its low light. There was just the slightest visibility, forcing me to turn on my cell phone's dim flashlight. Entering the Equestrian Center, I noticed something that startled me immensely. A very tall person, a man, stood about 10 to 15 feet into the Enchanted Forest Trail with his back towards me, standing completely still, his head facing the sky and his hands open, palms pointing in front of him while his arms were at his side. He was tall, approximately 6 feet, with a slim build, short dark hair, and wearing what looked to be light blue scrubs, or at least a very thin blue napkin-like material, and he was barefoot. What startled me the most was his demeanor and what he was doing. His stance was enough to scare anyone in that setting, but as I approached him slowly, it appeared to me he was shaking, vibrating, or slightly convulsing, but doing so while standing up. It didn't seem like he had any control over it, although he maintained his balance perfectly. Scared and not entirely sure what to do, I asked him, "Hello, excuse me?" I paused momentarily and raised my voice slightly with the next question. "Is everything all right?" When I said that, he stopped shaking altogether, but still didn't turn around or move another muscle. He just remained in that same creepy position and didn't move. For a brief moment, I thought I might have been imagining this. I glanced down at my dog, and she was also concerned with the state and condition of this man, and began growling quietly. Then I knew it wasn't all in my head. When I looked back up, he had moved closer to me, about 7 feet closer, now almost on my trail's path. I had only looked at my dog for a split second, and he did it without making a sound. He still wasn't facing me either, and his hands were still open, head still facing the sky. I wasn't about to wait and see what this guy was doing or what his intentions were, so I slowly eased my way past him towards the equestrian center as quietly as I could before I felt that I was at a safe enough distance to start sprinting as fast as I could away from this guy. When I reached the first arena of the equestrian center, I looked back in the direction of the forest, completely out of breath. And there he was. The man was standing on the edge of the trail outside of the forest, facing me. I was too far away to see his face, and frankly, I didn't want to. I couldn't make out his features. All I could see was his silhouette illuminated by the moonlight peeking through the forest's trail. I continued to run with no intention of stopping until I found someone. I had never been so happy to see my nagging neighbor Penny and her moody mare Jolene riding in the Milano area. She noticed my distress, but due to her already harsh opinions of me, I told her I had been on an endurance run and was just very out of breath and tired. I wanted to avoid any small-town gossip as much as I could. My mother arrived with impeccable timing. During the ride home, I broke down in a state of paranoia, distress, and panic at what I had just witnessed. My mother didn't know exactly what to make of it, so she recommended I file a police report with the local PD. About an hour after getting home, an officer showed up to take my statement. Following up the next day, the same officer claimed to have gone and checked out the area, but didn't find anyone or anything out of the blue, apart from partial bare footprints. However, there's nothing incriminating or suspicious about someone going for a walk without shoes. He played it off as a joke and accused me of being under the influence, but I can assure you, I was completely sober. Nothing ever came out of this. I attended weekly therapy sessions for almost 2 years following this event and never went on walks by myself again. I had night terrors about the man and still do. I still don't know what to make of it. I don't know if I ever will. A few years ago, I worked at a Jewish summer camp in North Georgia. As many of you might know, Georgia is a fairly conservative state and predominantly Christian. There are small Jewish communities and a few summer camps. I'd say this camp was more culturally Jewish than religious. There were no religious requirements or religion-specific focus. Rather, it was a place for kids who were often in the minority to meet other kids like them. Staff came from all over. We had many Australians, lots of Brits, a few Israelis, and people from various areas of the USA. Each night at around 10, most of the staff could go out on the town for a couple of hours. Enough staff remained behind to watch over the cabins. We rotated. This particular night, a group of about 5 of us decided to go to a local bar to grab a few beers. It had been a hot day and was a humid night, so we decided to sit outside on the patio. For some backstory on the town, generally, we were extremely well received by the community despite our differences. We brought in lots of revenue for the town during the summer. We bought supplies at the local Walmart and often took the campers on tubing trips, or occasionally out to dinner after a long hike on the Appalachian Trail. It was midsummer, so we'd been out to the bars in the area many times already that session. The 5 of us sat around a table, drinking and discussing the events of the day, as fellow employees typically would after work. About 30 minutes in, a white man in his 20s came up to our table. I distinctly remember a jagged scar on his cheek, but didn't think much of it at the time. He introduced himself, and then told us that he was having a party that night at his place. "Anyone can come," he said. Black, white, gay, straight. I found it odd that he'd open his speech with that disclaimer. Of course, the party should be open to everyone. Why did he feel the need to specify? But we'd all had a few beers and were feeling pretty loose. He talked for a bit longer, and nothing really seemed off. We told him we were working at a camp in the area and couldn't stay out, so we'd probably be heading back soon. An hour later, our group went out to the parking lot to get into the car. As we approached it, we saw the same guy come out of the shadows. He had a buddy with him with a shaved head. His expression was incredibly hateful. His eyes had changed. He pounded his fist into his hand, then took off his shirt and revealed a poorly inked SS tattoo. My stomach dropped. One of the bigger guys in my group, Kevin, immediately reacted by pulling a knife out of his back pocket. At summer camp, most of us staff carried knives. We spent a lot of time building campfires, etc. The original guy started shouting some anti-Semitic remarks and told us he was going to beat us down. Kevin started walking toward the two guys, but we pulled him back. He told us his buddies were on the way. Sure enough, some more guys started walking into the parking lot. It's all kind of blurry here. I remember jumping into one of the cars, pulling Kevin with us. It felt like we were surrounded, though there were probably only 7 or 8 of them. Rocks were thrown at the car. We sped off. My heart was beating like crazy. We never went back to that bar. On the bright side, when we told the story to the competing bar in town, the bartender lined up 6 shots, cheered us, and said we'd always be welcome in his bar in that town. I'm currently staying in a remote part of the United Kingdom and taking a break from working, which means more time to pursue my hobbies, one being photography. I had scoped out a creepy-looking tree formation in a nearby forest and set my camera and tripod up as the sun was coming down, for that extra creepy vibe. As I'm happily taking photos, I see a woman pass the entrance to the arched trees. This woman had parked her car next to mine when I arrived. She went past a couple of times, looking at me for prolonged periods each time she passed. I assume she wants to come up this path, but sees that I'm taking photos and decides to walk elsewhere. Approximately 5 minutes go by, and she appears again, this time walking towards me, dragging her left side slightly with this strange limp. She stops once and stares at me for a few seconds, then starts walking towards me again. I ask her if she's okay. I'm starting to put my camera away at this point and readying my tripod to use for self-defense if necessary, because the vibe I'm getting is way off. She starts grunting at me, then stops and stares again. At this point, she is close enough for me to realize that she's actually a man in women's clothing, wearing a wig. An uncomfortable moment passes, and she starts grunting again, walks towards the edge of the path, grabs a pile of leaves, and starts throwing them around. She grunts some more, and then walks off aimlessly into the forest. I call my friend to tell her what has happened, and ask that she stays on the phone in case this person comes back. I'll just take a couple more photos, and then I'm out. For a good 10 minutes, I hear the crunching of leaves circling me in the forest, and convince myself that it's the wildlife. Then, silence. I take the photos, and I haven't seen or heard the person for around 15 minutes now, so I assume I'm safe. I leave the path and see that the car is gone. However, I quickly notice that there is a man walking towards me from the entrance. It's the same guy. He has changed into men's attire, and as he walks past me, he shoots me a grin that sends shivers down my spine. I don't scare easily, but this guy just gave off all the wrong signals, causing this overwhelming feeling of dread to wash over me. I'm still on the phone at this point and holding my tripod over my shoulder, just in case. I quicken my pace and get back into my car. As I do so, I see him come out of the lane I had been down, stop and look around, then start walking towards my car with intent. I video for a while and then haul out of there, driving past his car that he had moved down the road and thinking, what the fuck just happened? I was back home for the summer for the first time in a year after starting university. Our home was just outside of a small town with forests all around. There was also a small man-made lake, diverged from a river that ran for miles through the forest and ramified into a few streams east of the lake. Near my home, there was a small grassy path that led to the river following a stream. It was a long walk, but one I used to go on often as a child. I knew the forests well, and where I could cut through dense trees to meet the stream. The walk always led me off the path, which turned northwest slowly, away from the stream, and then took a sharp turn to the west after a few miles, at which point the stream was hidden deep in the forest. I'd continue to walk north and follow the stream through the forest to get to the river, then follow the river west to get to the lake. It's easy to get lost in this forest because the terrain isn't just a slope down to the water. It goes up and down, and you end up completely surrounded by trees. I'd spent many days wandering around there alone or with my dad over the span of 18 years, never seeing anybody else in the forest. I went there twice that summer, both times alone. The first time, I left in the morning, walked along the path away from the stream to the sharp bend, then cut back into the forest. I reached the stream after an hour or so. As I was running my hands in the water, I heard a bell from far away, coming from the north. Something was making a bell ring fervently and periodically, which I found strange. I listened well, wondered if it was a lost hunting dog, and started moving towards the sound. I realized it couldn't have been an animal. The bell was too heavy, given how clear the sound was, to be on a collar. I kept moving, and the bell moved away from me. It stopped completely after 5 minutes. The stream wasn't big or strong enough to carry a bell, even enclosed in a tin, and the river was too far still. I thought of everything, but nothing explained the sound, apart from one obvious thing, which I just didn't feel comfortable with for some reason. I knew it had to have been a person. I stopped thinking about it and just walked on normally, until I found a badger. A bloomin' dead one, carefully decapitated. It had obviously been done with a knife. It was fairly fresh, the body was still limp, and there wasn't too much smell coming from it. The wound was full of maggots, but I knew that happened soon after exposure. The sound of the bell had been following the stream, and so had I. So, the badger was put there, maybe killed there, or at least decapitated, while I was walking that way. I suppose, I don't really know. Nothing else happened that day. 1 week later, I went back for the second time that summer, and the last time ever. I left home at around 6 p.m. I made it to the stream, then walked to the river in an hour, then decided to go back the way I came, because it was getting late and raining quite heavily. The sun set at around 9 p.m. I was walking as fast as I could. The sound of the rain in the trees was surreal and loud. I was somewhat trotting with my head down for a while through the clearest and most open part of the forest when I bumped into something heavy. The smell was sickly. It was the decomposing body of the badger with its head strung to its front paws. That area looked a bit like a ham because of the way it was tied, just swinging from a tree. It was this putrid bag of stench, wet and dripping green liquid. I started gagging. I had some sort of mucus-textured fluid in my hair. It was repulsive. At first, I just stared at it, slightly gobsmacked. Then I started fidgeting violently because I felt like I was drenched in its juices. I was soaking from the rain, and my senses became confused. It felt like a bucket of ice-cold water had been thrown over me when I realized that I walked the same way to get to the river, so someone had strung up the body after I'd passed it on the way there. Someone knew I'd see it. So, was someone watching me and running around the forest? Were the faint sounds of branches breaking around me not animals? I looked around and started jogging. I was half running, half walking away from the stream back towards the path for a while, when I heard the bell again. I proceeded to call my dad while running. I told him to meet me on the path where it sharply turns west, the closest part of the path to me, to go as fast as he could, and that someone was in the forest. I can't explain the feeling I had. It was like I just shat out my intestines and stomach. I literally felt the hairs on my neck raise despite being soaked. It was dark, and I jogged as fast as I could. I was panicking because the path was still a bit far away, just too far to feel safe. It was still raining. Every single sound was muffled. I felt like everything was further away than ever before. The bell went on for way longer than the last time, on and off. I felt like it was surrounding me at one point. The fear, combined with my compromised hearing and the fact that I couldn't flip and breathe properly, was making me slightly lose my sense of direction. I was automatically heading southwest, but I wasn't really sure what I was even doing. I was breathing like a goddamn horse, coughing my lungs up, kind of crying out loud, like a toddler does, tripping over leaves and twigs like an idiot. I stayed on the phone with my mum, who was on her way with my dad. I kept hearing sounds, but I wasn't sure what they were. My mum was screaming on the phone at the same time that they were on the path, that I needed to run, that my dad had gotten out and was heading east from the path bend. I was terrified, so I went into survival mode. I was doing the half-running, half-speed-walking thing again because I was out of breath. Then, I heard branches break, clear footsteps for the first time from down in the forest, and the bell ringing louder. I didn't want to, but I looked over my shoulder. That's when I saw what was in the forest with me. A tall figure creeping in my direction at the very end of the clearing, ringing this bell slowly in front of his stomach. I could tell he was staring straight at me. Now, I don't know if I had a hidden secret sprinting ability or instinctual adrenaline-induced superhuman powers, but when I tell you I ran for my life, I didn't look back once. I screamed as much as I could. I lied, "I'm on the phone with the police, they are on the path. Dad, I can see you, I'm here." I wanted to yell, "Dad, please, where are you?" But I kept that to myself. I felt like something awful was going to happen. I felt like the man was right behind me. I kept telling myself not to look back. I was gasping and wheezing, crying so hard and screaming for my dad. I felt shivers on my neck, and then switched off. I just ran. I even dropped my bag and only realized I didn't have it anymore when I was in the car. I felt like my phone was my only way home. Things no longer felt real. It was like my legs were moving by themselves. I didn't know if the man was still following me. I could only hear my heart beating in my ears and the bell. I finally heard my dad shout my name, and I knew he was coming my way and that he could see me because of the intonation of his voice. I pretty much lunged at him when we got to each other. My dad heard the bell too. My mum could hear it on the phone. She was waiting with the car ready to leave fast. This happened to my roommate and me 2 years ago when we drove into the national forest just outside the town we live in. We go to a small college in New England, about 3 hours from any major city. For context, this forest has quite a few urban legends surrounding it, and the local community, although they do go there often, have many superstitions about how to be safe while there. I had just broken up with my partner, and my roommate could sense I was feeling down. Finals were just around the corner, so she decided to help me get my mind off things and suggested we go to a nice spot she had found last week, just to chill and de-stress. We took a couple of beers with us and drove to this secluded spot in the forest. From the moment we left the main asphalt road in the forest, I saw a couple of things that unsettled me. You could see the abandoned houses of a ghost town from the higher ground the road was on, and we saw this old doll hanging from a rope on a tree. Creepy stuff, but we didn't really give it a second thought and kept driving. We got to a clearing, parked our car behind some trees, popped open the back of our SUV, and started talking and playing music. About 10 minutes into this, 2 cars appeared from the road and parked in the clearing. My friend didn't pay them any attention. She kept talking, but as I was facing them from where I sat, I couldn't stop watching what they did. A guy popped out of each car, talked for a few minutes, and then I saw them take out a long object covered in a dark plastic bag from the back of one of the cars. This is when I noticed these guys had guns, not shotguns, which I often see in this town, but handguns. Then they started lighting the bag on fire. I told my friend to get down, and she turned around and saw them for the first time. Black smoke was rising from the bag, and between trying to keep my head down and steal glances at them, I saw them take out a second object and heard them shoot at it right before they set it on fire. I don't know how long my friend and I were lying there in silence, but it was definitely long enough to let the terror sink in and whisper to each other how much we loved each other in case this was what we thought it was. At some point, I looked up and saw that they were pointing at our car and walking into the woods, maybe trying to follow our tracks or look for us. All I know is that right then, I told my friend to jump into the driver's seat and make a run for it. I shut the back door, and between that and the car starting up, the guys heard it and started running toward us, then ran toward one of their cars and hopped in. We went over a hill, and driving way above what was safe for dirt roads on a hillside, we lost them. We drove to a neighboring town and roamed around for a while, just to make sure no one was following us before we went back to our dorm. That day, we tried to make fun of the whole situation and got really drunk before finally breaking down and crying from knowing we had seen something we were not supposed to. At first, we were terrified of telling anyone, but eventually, we did tell officers on campus who contacted the police. They never found anything. This happened a couple of years ago when I was 16. It was a warm summer night. On nights like these, my friend and I would often grab a pack of cigarettes and a bottle of beer each and go outside to enjoy them. We come from a really small town where everybody is somehow connected. So the only way for us to drink and smoke without our parents knowing was to do so in secluded places. Luckily, the town is surrounded by huge forests. We were both very familiar with them, since we practically grew up there. One night, as usual, we grabbed our forbidden contraband, some flashlights, and headed out. We took the path through the long meadow, which ended at the edge of the forest. From there, a path led through the forest, which was a 20-minute walk back to town over steep downhill terrain. At the place where the meadow and the forest meet, there is a gazebo with a fireplace where people go for picnics. As we were walking through the meadow, we would stop a few times to ensure from afar that the gazebo was unoccupied. It was around 11 p.m., and the night was incredibly dark. Even though we were out in the open, we had to use our flashlights to see anything. When we made sure that the coast was clear, we approached the gazebo to light our first cigarette. We stood there, puffing and talking, while always scouting our surroundings with the beams of our flashlights. After maybe 5 minutes, we decided to take the path through the forest back to town. We walked about 30 meters, at which point we couldn't see the place where we were previously standing. That's when we heard it. From the gazebo, where we were standing just seconds earlier, came a long, terrifying scream. It sounded as if somebody, a man by the sound of it, was being cut to pieces while still very much alive. The kind of scream that turns your blood to ice instantly. After the first scream, there was a pause for a few seconds. During this whole time, we were both so scared we couldn't even move. Then, it started again, even louder and more terrifying. The second scream snapped us back to reality. Without a word, we just started sprinting through the rough terrain, not once looking back. At this point, I was so pumped up with adrenaline that I couldn't hear anything except my own heartbeat resonating in my ears. We had never run that fast, and we didn't stop until we reached the lights of town. When we finally did, we both just sat on a sidewalk under a lamppost, panting and gasping for air. Nobody said anything for a good 30 minutes, until my friend finally spoke a single but quite eloquent word. Fuck. After a while, we started talking about it. We concluded that either somebody was having fun at our expense, or somebody got really hurt. In the end, we decided to head back there first thing in the morning. But surprise, surprise, there were no signs of anyone being injured or struggling. We decided that it was just someone playing pranks on us. However, to this day, it keeps gnawing at me. Something just doesn't add up. We were standing there for quite some time, so the person must have been very well hidden. On the other hand, it would be almost impossible for anyone to just walk in there without any light since it was so dark. And even if they had some kind of torch, we would certainly have spotted them. I worked in forest maintenance and forest agriculture for a while. Some friends owned a big plot of land in the Rocky Mountains. A group of us, all guys aged 18 to 38, would gather several times a year, go into the mountains for several days, and clear scrub brush, make fire breaks, and when appropriate, cut Christmas trees. This particular time, it was early spring, and our crew of 9, on 3 Gator 4WD vehicles, was at about 9,200 feet elevation. There was a fairly significant amount of snow on the ground. We had put in a long day's work and were headed to camp until the old guy of the crew asked if we wanted to head to the slope. This was a nearly treeless slope, free of any large rocks, about 100 yards wide, with tracks of big trees on either side. We would go there and, using one of the gators, tow a tube downhill in the snow. It was so much fun. We got to the slope, set up a fire pit, cracked open the whiskey, and started having our fun. We all took several turns being towed. Jeff was the new guy, and the youngest, 18. We were giving him the craziest rides, swinging him close to the trees to freak him out as a sort of initiation. It was about 1 a.m., pitch black except for our dying fire, and lightly snowing. Not the smartest or safest thing I've ever done, but one of the most fun. Just as we were wrapping up one of the last rides and heading back to camp, Jeff freaked out. He was stumbling over his words and couldn't express himself very clearly. But finally, we got out of him that about 3/4 of the way down, he had seen a man standing a few yards into the woods. He was wearing a trapper's hat, one of those with a flipped-up bill and ear flaps like in Fargo, and a plaid mackinaw. We were all a bit skeptical. I mean, we were on a big plot of private property, at elevation, and in somewhat hostile weather. But we took the rifles off the gators, got our flashlights, and gave it a look. We didn't find anything, not even footprints. We chalked it up to inexperience, a spooky environment, and of course, whiskey, and headed back to camp about 800 feet away. Jeff didn't sleep all night. He was convinced he saw someone. The next morning, we drove the gators to the house on the property, got in our trucks, and headed into the little town nearby for breakfast. After breakfast, we were heading back to the property to say our goodbyes and go our separate ways. As we neared the intersection of the public dirt road and the private dirt drive to the house, there were several police cars and an ambulance. We stopped to talk to the police, who informed us the closest neighbors had found a body in the ditch as they were heading down the mountain. Police had followed footprints up the hill, to the slope, and then across a neighboring property to another perpendicular road. They asked if we knew anything, and of course, we told them about Mackinac Man. Sure enough, it was him. Self-inflicted gunshot, probably just minutes after we encountered him. Still don't know what he wanted, if he was any danger to us, or if we could have helped. Poor Jeff got his whiskey and meals paid for the next several weeks, but he still gets guff about it to this day. So every 4th of July, we go camping, or to the beach, or something to spend time vacationing with our family. Last year, we went to a beach about an hour from where we live, to spend the weekend. It was me, my husband, our 2 kids, my brother, his wife, their son, and my grandparents. We decided to go fishing one night, at a pier about 15 minutes from our hotel. The kids started to get tired and fussy, so I told everyone I'd take all the kids, and we could go watch DVDs in the car so that they could fish a bit longer. Now, I'm 25, but I'm built like the average 14-year-old. No exaggeration. I buy clothes from Abercrombie Kids. I'm also super paranoid, not only because someone could easily grab me, but also because I have children and watch the news too much. Also important, my husband is ex-military, and we live in the country. We have guns, including a small handgun that he leaves in the console of the car for me. Anyway, I'm in the driver's seat of our car, 3 kids in the back watching movies and dozing off. The pier we went to has a row of parking and moderate lighting. There were maybe 5 or 6 other cars there. There was an SUV parked on the passenger side. A small truck pulls up on the other side of the SUV, and 2 men get out of it. They go to the bed of the truck and start getting their gear, looking over at my car a few times in between getting their stuff. They would stare for a few seconds and get more stuff. Stare and get more stuff. It doesn't take me that long to get fishing gear and kids out of my car, so it made me uncomfortable how long they lingered. They finally go down to the pier to fish. My husband calls to check on me. I told him about my experience, and he reminded me about the gun. One in the chamber, safety on. So since I'm sitting in a parking lot at night, I decide to get the gun out and sit it within my reach. It wasn't 10 minutes later, creepy dudes come back to their truck. They had only been gone about 15 minutes, which is weird considering fishing takes a lot longer than that. They wouldn't have had time to even walk down the pier, set up, and cast out. At this point, I sit the gun in my lap. They're at their truck. They keep looking around the SUV that's parked in between us to look over at me. I look back. They do this a few times, talking to each other, all while looking around this SUV to look at me. I don't know if they're looking at me or my car, which isn't a high-end car, just a Jetta, but it was brand new, or if they were looking at my children in the back seats. I honestly don't even care. They were being sketchy. One of the men decided that he was going to walk to the back of the SUV and stand for a minute, just looking into my car. I looked at him, picked up the gun, waved and kinda half smiled, as if to say, "Hey, how are you? Leave me and my children the heck alone." The man said something to his buddy, got in their truck, and they left. I called my husband and told him it was time to get everyone together to leave. I don't know what the heck they were looking for, or what they wanted. Creeping on an armed and paranoid mother with her children in the car isn't the best thing to do late at night. A few years ago, while fishing with some friends at a well-frequented but poorly lit catfishing hotspot, our night out was totally ruined by some weirdo. I was a little bit tipsy, gathering firewood. My buddy was smoking a cigarette, watching the tips of our poles for a bite. The girls had just squatted to pee nearby, and we were enjoying our little campfire. By no coincidence, a strange man calmly and almost silently walked up to our group. He came from the pitch black, as if he'd been lurking or watching us from afar. His mannerisms were very deliberate, as if he were somehow in control of the situation. My buddy gave him the cold shoulder, but I tried making nervous small talk with the stranger. I assumed he was also a fisherman, looking for info on what was biting. No. He seemed totally indifferent to any talk about fishing, and he certainly didn't sense the emotional mood of the group toward him. The girls were definitely creeped out and nervous. At an awkward lull in the conversation, the stranger pulled out a large hunting knife and rubbed his thumb across the blade in a self-soothing way. I assumed maybe he was a lonely nom-vet, nothing more. Abruptly, my buddy started packing up all of our gear and turned ice cold. I remember the stranger getting a head start, leaving on foot somewhere ahead of us. I'll never forget the car ride home. My buddy and his wife explained that they had actually encountered that creep at the fishing spot before, shrugged him off with some disinterested small talk. And upon leaving for a short errand, they realized the creep followed them to the store and appeared in the aisle they were headed for. My buddy was visibly shaken up by this latest encounter. It put a damper on a favorite hangout of ours, and I'm pretty sure he followed us all home that night. I read people quite well, and there was a definite subtext to the uncanny conversation I had with this guy. Looking back, it seemed like he had something welling up inside of him that he was alluding to. Perhaps a bit of self-restraint toward us, but certainly not mercy or empathy. I followed his train of thought, and it seemed like he had an air of accomplishment and physical dominance over the group. There were some other highly specific circumstantial aspects of the encounter that lead me to believe this guy was a murderer. I don't want to get into specifics, but this guy was hands down the creepiest motherfucker I've ever met. There are several cold cases of dead or missing women within a 200-mile radius of this guy. He had all the cold mannerisms of a complete sociopath. After almost 10 years, I can't shake the feeling that if we met again, I'd be brutally murdered. When I went home for 3 weeks about a month and a half ago, my dad decided that we should do a bit of night fishing. I'm not a huge fan of night fishing, or any sort of fishing, or my dad for that matter. Our personalities are way too similar, and if you leave us together for more than an hour, there may be blood left over by the time he and I are done playing several dozen rounds of fisticuffs between the stubborn arguing and shouting. Anyways, Dad decided to take me to this river up by our new house that they just finished building. My mom and brother stayed behind as we traipsed through the dark woods. Now, my family lives in Oregon, and the river was about 1.5 miles from my family's property over massive fallen trees and stumps that I easily tripped on, not knowing the lay of the land. My dad merely scoffed at me and reminded me that city living makes you soft. He didn't say it just like that, but something along those lines, like some stereotypical cowboy out of an old Wild West film. I blame the fact that I didn't know the area as well as he did, and it just spiraled downhill from there, and arguing broke out between us, making the peaceful night loud and chaotic. We didn't stop arguing the entire way down to the river, my father critiquing my less-than-Christian lifestyle while I criticized his manner of parenting my 20-year-old autistic brother. When we got to the river, we finally settled into an awkward, tense silence as we got our gear out. I knew that this fight was far from over as I sat down on a fallen stump and shivered my ass off. I had lived in a warm climate for over a year, and honestly, coming out here was probably him punishing me for even leaving the Pacific Northwest. We refused to talk to one another as our lights danced across the water when my dad suddenly stood up, his light landing on the other side of the river. There, on the other bank, stood a man looking right at us. He wore a bright orange t-shirt and a pair of scraggly jeans, but for the most part, looking pretty average, if you counted the machete hanging from his belt. My dad snapped at me to start packing all our stuff up, and so I followed his command as my dad started shouting at the man across the river. Their conversation was mostly lost to the roar of the white-capped water, but I could see the man making agitated sweeps with his hands every time I dared to peek. Their voices grew, and my fear grew with it. My father has never been one to carry protection in the woods, hence why I was born. This man was armed and possibly dangerous with that machete, and while we had the river between us, it was shallow and had plenty of places to cross, and even if it was snow runoff, I had no doubt this man could be behind us in mere minutes. Had we wandered onto his property by mistake and just not have known it? Drop the gear and let's go. My dad snarled at me as I took one last look up to see the man starting to walk into the water, his hand flitting against his weapon. My dad put a firm hand on my shoulder and led me back into the woods towards our house. My dad is an ultramarathoner. He runs like it's going out of style, and my mostly out-of-shape self probably wouldn't have kept up if I hadn't been so terrified. I couldn't hear if the man was coming after us, my heartbeat being so loud in my ears, but I followed my dad so closely I almost ran into him several times. Finally, we found our road and made a break for my parents' house. As soon as we were through the front door, my dad had the doors locked and was keeping a vigilant watch out the windows, making sure no crazy men with machetes were creeping up on our house. Finally, when he figured there were no guys wearing orange t-shirts, we sat down and began to talk about our experience with my mom. We avoided the part where we had been arguing, but told her everything else. We went to bed without apologizing, and I honestly felt horrid. The next day, with the only gun he owned, my father and I walked back out into the woods after calling the police. They said that there was a guy who did enjoy scaring people off of forest land in the area, and that we shouldn't be too concerned. Feeling a bit sheepish, we went back to the place where we had left our gear, both of us apologizing for our lackluster behavior the night before. When we returned to what we believed to be the spot, we saw that our fishing poles had been bent and all the line had been draped from tree to tree, and the tackle box was gone. However, me and my dad didn't fight again for the rest of my trip home. So this all starts when my two buddies, me 19 and them 20 and 17, and I went to fish off this bank on the river in the afternoon. The layout is that you drive over the levee before you drop down into a boat ramp and parking area right next to the river. We brought pizza, beer, weed, music, and of course our rods, hoping we'd just hang out and do some late-night fishing. At this point, we're all set up on the bank with our chairs and speaker, having a nice evening, and it's probably been 2 hours, and it's 9 p.m. now. All three of us were feeling good with some beers in our system, and then all of a sudden, we hear 2 cars with super loud music pull up, and everyone gets out. The cars must have had 4 to 5 people in each one, because I heard a lot of people talking, but it was all in Spanish, so I couldn't make anything out. We tried to ignore it, but then it gets so loud that we couldn't enjoy ourselves, so we start packing our stuff to head back to the car and just chill out while we sober up. While we're gathering our things, we start to hear what sounds like an argument going down. We start to hear lots of glass shattering and people screaming at the top of their lungs. They couldn't see us, but they were basically no more than 20 feet behind our heads. At this point, we're just keeping quiet, and then you start to hear what sounded like someone getting punched repeatedly, and then a loud splash into the river by the boat ramp and someone saying, "Nah, leave him," which were the only words spoken in English. At this point, we didn't know what we just heard happen, and we didn't want to stick around and find out. The 3 of us trekked back up the steep incline to get back to the car, but as soon as we came into their view, they all got back into the 2 cars and quickly sped back over the levee. Except, we spotted one of the cars just sitting on the top of the levee slowly creeping forward. When we turned our car on, that car then went fully over the levee. We realized we were the only car left in the parking lot, and it was now pitch black outside, around 9:30 p.m. We sat there for no more than 30 seconds, just trying to process what we just heard go down, and then we decided we needed to get out of there completely and park somewhere to sober up all the way. As we're going over the levee, the road goes over it, and then down, and makes a sharp left. Right after we take that sharp left, our hearts drop when we see 4 cars lined up completely horizontally across the road, blocking us from getting through. There are orchards on our left and right, so there was no going around at all. At this point, my buddy just gassed it straight towards their bumpers to try and split in between the cars and get out of there, even if it meant damaging the front end of his car. Just as we do that, one of the 4 cars slightly moved out of the way, creating a gap. We flew right through it and got out of there, and they were laying on the horn while we passed through. We don't know what their intentions were, but clearly there were 2 cars in the boat ramp area where we were at, and 2 cars on the other side of the levee blocking the road from anyone else coming in. I ended up filing a police report, just in case they really did dump a body into the river. It happens all the time here. But I haven't heard anything back. Definitely one of my most terrifying experiences.